Thank you very much, John. Thank you very much, Detlef. So we have to move to plenary one now here. And just an announcement, let's say, this community is very much focused on mitigation, but we know how adaptation is also important. So we had to do some adaptations in our program as well. And then we are moving from a kind of Pareto optimum to a second best solution. And we are replacing one of the speakers of plenary one, which is Joaquim Levy, the former Minister of Finance, who had problems with his flight back from the US to Brazil, and he is not going to be able to make it. So basically, the second best solution here is to invite Alexandre Sclo. Please, Alexandre, my colleague from my university, and he's going to replace Joaquim Levy. And also let me invite Fábio Feldmann. Fábio Feldmann is a lawyer here in Brazil, doing different terms. He was a congressman in Brazil, and interesting enough, let's say, he was one of the congressmen that back in 1988 wrote the new Constitution of Brazil. And he was the person in that committee in charge of the environmental issues that are addressed by the Brazilian Constitution. That's why it's so important also to have Fábio here with us today. I was the one that, let's say, put this interesting name for this plenary session here, Food for Thought. But the focus here is really on that issue of, let's say, phasing out of fossil fuels during a COP that is claiming for action. So this is exactly the topic that we have here. And we are going to have 10-minute presentations by Alexandre and then by Fábio, and then we are going to open for questions from the audience. So thank you very much. Alexandre, the word is yours.
Nice to be the second best solution, and we try to, yeah. This is a kind of Paretian optimization solution. And as you know, I'm Alexander Sklo. I will try to be in time. So when Roberto told me to speak today, I wrote some notes here in order to be on the 10 minutes time. So I'm Alexander Sklo, and Roberto asked me to replace Joaquim Levy. And perhaps I think because of my expertise in petroleum, actually I am a chemical engineer, I'm also in the Integrated Assessment Modeling Committee, but in my very beginning I'm a chemical engineer that worked a lot in the petroleum industry, and I think your expectations, and maybe my expectation as well, is that in a few years, like petroleum, I might become a fossil in a museum. But we have a challenge, the fossilization of the energy system, and I'm talking about the fossilization and not decarbonization, because we are going to need the carbon, but we have to defossilize the energy system, and then we have to find carbon sources to do that. But we have some challenge here, because when I look at the oil and gas sector from a market perspective, there are premium oil products that are at risk. I think all of us think about gasoline, as gasoline is at risk in the short and maybe in the medium term, but we have some oil products that are difficult to replace in the short term and in the medium term. I'm talking about jet fuel, bunker fuel, diesel fuels, and petrochemicals. And petrochemicals means a lot for the energy transition, because we are going to need more materials, and this means petrochemicals. And we have to produce the petrochemicals, not changing the oil refineries. We are going to co-produce fuels as well with a very low shadow price. The petrochemicals will do what gasoline did in the last century. Gasoline will pay the price for the other oil products. So we have this challenge related to replacing the petroleum industry, the petroleum as a feedstock and as a fossil fuel. There is a global product market that recovered post-COVID, particularly for diesel, jet fuel, bunker fuel, and petrochemicals, as I told you before. And there are doubts about what to do in the midterm with gasoline. Actually, I expected that gasoline reduced its market in this year or in the last year, but in fact, gasoline is booming in USA. When I read the news in the summer season in USA, I was quite afraid, because it's like reading the news in the last 10 or 20 years. Everything is the same. People is demanding gasoline during the driving season. So it's quite the same, but we know that gasoline is the premium fuel at risk. The result is that new investments in refiners are occurring in the Southeast Asia for refiners integrated into petrochemicals, naphtha instead of gasoline. Refining margins are were right in the last 4 years, but there are no investments in new refineries focused on fuels. So this is a strange situation, because this has never happened before in history. High margins without investments in new refineries, in greenfield refineries. But we have some investments in refineries integrated to petrochemicals. This means that there are doubts about the petroleum products market, but especially doubts about gasoline. There are many opportunities to take advantage of that. Actually, we have many units in oil refiners that can be revamped to process renewable feedstocks. For example, the most easily one are the vegetable oils, but we can process ethanol, we can process biomass, biofuels, pyrolysis oil, and also produce hydrogen with electrolysis and use the oxygen in oil refiners. So we have to think about that. There is no major investments in refineries focused on fuels, and we have a lot of refiners that can be revamped, can be changed, can be transformed to process renewable feedstocks. On the upstream side, these are the major challenge for us. The natural rate of decline in supply. So this, I'm talking about what is happening on the oil supply. And when you see the ramp-up phase, the fields on the ramp-up phase and the fields that have surpassed the plateau, the production plateau, we have more or less a declining rate, a natural declining rate of 5 to 6 million barrels per day. This is the declining rate that's happening as of today. And remember that this declining rate is not linear, but follows a kind of harmonic and exponential, depending on the fields. But effectively, people usually think about the oil supply in the next 50, 60 years, but actually we have a problem for the next 10 years, because the market is not declining and the oil supply is declining. So how can we deal with that? We have to transform the industry. We have to change the oil system. We have to change the energy system. We have to defossilize the energy system. But in the next 10 years, what we see is that oil market demand is not decreasing. And it should decrease more than the oil supply curve, the natural declining rate of the oil supply industry. 6 million barrels per day now, and maybe 7 or 10 in the next 15 years, in order to have a kind of demand gap and not a supply gap. So this is a major problem, and I think this explains why the opportunity cost for replenishing oil reserves is so high, why the oil majors, the oil companies are reinvesting in the upstream activities, because they know that in the next 10 years, the oil supply will naturally decrease more than the oil demand. So we have this gap. And this explains the high opportunity cost, and this is a major challenge for us, because when you deal with the next 10 years investing in replenishing oil reserves, this means that you compromise the next 50 years, the next 60 years, so you have to deal with that. We have to find ways to make the defossilization of the economy viable without burning the access to the energy service. We have to rapidly change the oil products market, and maybe do what all chemists, like myself, I'm a chemical engineer, have proposed at some point. Oil is too precious and also in a way too thermodynamically improbable to be burned. The best use for the oil is in the chemical industry for long-term, the long-standing carbon stock of chemical products, not to use it burning the oil. So thank you.
Thank you, Alexandre. Let's keep the questions for a second moment. Let me pass the word to Fábio Feldmann here. Fábio, thank you for being here.
Okay, first of all, thank you for the opportunity to be here. You know, Roberto is my advisor, informal advisor. When I need someone to help me and help the discussion of public policies on energy, I called Roberto. And at the final, I propose you to buy a cellular phone to Roberto. Please, cellular phone for Roberto. Thalita, you know how difficult it's to have access to Roberto. As he said, I was a former parliamentarian, and at the first mandate, it was the process of democratization of the country, and the writing of a new constitution was the final process of the democratization of the country. And I was elected the environmental platform, and after that I participate in the organization of Rio 92, especially the civil society forum, and now I'm still working with some NGOs. I used to be in the board of Greenpeace and some other organizations. What is difficult for us? First of all, you know, from a political point of view, I think the challenge is how can you persuade society about the decisions that will have very important impacts in the future generations. And you have to make a distinction between a political dimension and electoral dimension, because when you think about politicians, you know, when they are supposed to make decisions, what is in charge? What is the key question? How will be impacted in the next election? And this is very important for democracies, that you have elections after 4-6 years. In the presidential system and the parliamentarian systems, you have more time. But in fact, it's very difficult to take decisions, especially when the decisions will have a very instant impact. And I felt this because when I was Environmental Secretary of State of São Paulo, we have problems of air pollution in the city. Then we decide to implement a very interesting program of no circulation cars during some days. And it was a success implementation project, but I lost the election. Then I think what we have to discuss, especially in democracies, what kind of architecture you have to design in order to have a good governance, climate governance and environmental governance. You know how, and in the case of Brazil, we are discussing, he's my new advisor, you know, because, for example, we are discussing some new litigations in Brazil and overseas. What I'm discussing with some people is what we can do facing the petrochemical oil companies. Some years ago, they used to say that they are energy companies, but now in many countries, especially in Brazil, the Petrobras is so important, and to be president of Petrobras is more important to be governor of many states, and even it's more important to be minister, state minister, because Petrobras is a very, very powerful company. And the discussion that we are just having among some lawyers, you know, be lawyer and politician at the same time is very difficult. You know, it's not very popular. I'm lawyer. Oh, are you politician? Oh, and then we are discussing how can we provide some funds for in the future to make the oil companies to be prepared to have assets to pay the damage that the use of fossil fuels are provoking. Then we are discussing this because, you know, let's talk about COP. As I told you, I was not really a negotiator. When I was in the Congress, the discussion, what can be done, it was almost 40 years ago, to have a representation of civil society. You know, until the Rio conference, civil society played no very important role. After that, you know, it's a very important stakeholders to listen. You have to listen civil society. And I'm following all these negotiations, the writing of the convention. The convention was based on the first report of IPCC, you know, you can read there. And you can, if you read the Article 6 of the convention, everything is done. If you implemented this article, you are not supposed to discuss Kyoto Protocol or even Paris Agreement. But why is so difficult when you are discussing the implementation of the convention, even Kyoto Protocol or even Paris Agreement, is how can you translate the decisions that were taken in the multilateral negotiations in national policies. Because when you are talking about national policies or even subnational policies, you know, how can you persuade societies that it's important to do this now, taking into consideration future generations? When we talk about sustainability, you know, everybody is very tired of the discussion of sustainability. You always mention social dimension, economic dimension, environmental dimension. But what I think is more important is the future, is the role of taking into consideration future generations. And taking into consideration future generations, the idea is to think in the future. Then the challenge, in my opinion, first of all, in the scopes, is how to implement it. You know, and in Brazil, especially, and even in the United States, you have a presidential system. Then what we face in the past, under many situations, that you have an agreement, but how to have the ratification of the agreement in the Congress. When we are discussing Kyoto Protocol, there was no problem because we are talking about obligations of industrialized countries. Today, the political dimension in domestic policies in Brazil is that you are affecting some very important sectors, especially the agribusiness sector. Then we are facing very difficulties to have ratification of the agreements when you need the ratification, or even to keep the environmental and climate legislations. If we are supposed to write a new constitution now, it should be impossible to have what we got 40 years ago. Because, you know, you are just confronting very concrete interests. Then the question, and this is why I asked Roberto to stay here, is how can you help us to design public policies and to implement public policies? You know, this is challenging in Brazil, very challenging in Brazil, and you see what's going on in the US. When you know, we can talk about Trump policies, but we never can forget that he was elected. In Brazil, is the same. We have a former president of Brazil that explicitly against environmental issues, Indian issues, and he was not able to implement his policies because we have a new constitution, not so new constitution, and we went to the courts in order to avoid this tendency to not to implement or even to change the Brazilian constitution. Then my question for you is the following. Okay, we need to have the energetic transition. What are the key points? What can be the new policies or even new legislation, and how can we do this? That is important to have the possibility of implementation, at the same time have the support of the electors. Because I'm saying, when you talk about political dimension, you talk about more abstract, let me tell you this, dimension. When you talk about electoral dimension, you know, you must take into consideration that the idea is to have the support of the new electors or the next electors in the next election. And you see what happened with Trump, and we see what happened in Brazil, and this is very challenging. Then you know, must help us to design public policies that can be implemented from the perspective of the electors, the elections, and to be sure that we can implement this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fábio. And pretty much everybody here is going to vote for you in the new elections. Well, we have some time now for some questions. So, questions from the audience, please. Feel free to raise your hand, and then we can address 2 or 3 questions, perhaps. Gunnar?
I have a question. Hello?
Yes, yes.
I have a question to Alexandre. Thank you very much. Very interesting thoughts about the oil markets. You say you expect that there will be a supply squeeze, so to say. At the same time, we see very rapid dynamics with electric vehicle ramp-ups, especially in China and other countries. So how do you see the demand development? Wouldn't that be also an argument that maybe the oil demand goes down relatively quickly because of all these electric vehicles that are coming in now?
Yeah, I agree with you. We have seen things that are changing very rapidly, especially in the Southeast Asia, and the impacts in other countries, like, for example, Brazil. But we need to face the urgency to do that. And, you know, there are some oil product markets that are hard to defossilize and hard to replace in the short term. And by not replacing these oil products, the main issue is with these existing oil refineries, we will still produce the other oil products. And, for example, and also maybe answering also, Fábio, your last question, we have to target on the diesel market, especially for buses, and I have a lot of expectation for electric buses. I think this will be rapidly and a very fast possibility of replacing diesel without compromising the energy service access of the low-income parts of the population. This is a very important thing for the emerging countries. But for trucks, we will still need more development and infrastructure investment for long-distance trucks. For the bunker fuels, we have a lot of problems here. I know that we have many possibilities, but we have the long lifetime of ships, and we have the global market, the global trade industry, and we have to face the fact that the bunker, the sustainable bunker fuels and the motorization for the ships will mean cost and implementation and investments in harbors and so on. So we need to face this diesel market. It's no longer the fuel oil market, but this is a diesel market. Without facing that, trucks and ships, this means that if you use a more expensive structure, this means inflation, and this means more problem for your election. Because you know, the crisis in France 10 years ago, Gilets jaunes, it's related to diesel prices. The crisis in Ecuador, I think 4 or 5 years ago, and now, this year, the indigenous people were contesting the current government, is related to diesel prices and the impacts in freight transportation and inflation. Also in Brazil, 10 or 3 years ago, it's diesel prices, so we have to target on diesel. We have to target on jet fuel, not for the high-income classes, but also for the low-income classes. If you have sustainable aviation fuels with a high price, this means that part of the Brazilian population won't be able to fly, but not to fly Rio de Janeiro, São Paulo, it's to fly for a continental country. So my point is, we have to target on this, how to replace oil products. I think gasoline, it's an easy situation, and maybe also diesel for urban buses, but diesel for long distance, jet fuel, I think, and bunker, it's our target, if you want to target something on the oil industry.
Thank you, Alexandre. I think we have time for one more question. Yes, please.
Thank you very much, both of you, for the very insightful talk. And I have a question for Fábio. I'm just wondering that you shared an experience where you mentioned you were successfully implementing the policy for limiting car for the air pollution, but you faced the challenge in the next election. So I was just wondering whether you have any positive example to share where you have a win-win situation that you successfully also implemented some environmental policy and harvest the benefit, while also winning the support in the next election vote. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. I think there is, as I told you, I am an environmentalist for many years. And we are discussing how to be more influential now. And when you compare environmentalism 40 years ago and now, what I think about this digital means are very important, but they are not enough. I think the only way that we have to put pressure on governments and even companies is mobilize people and put people in the streets. In the case of Brazil, let me give you the example of deforestation. You know, the main source of the emission of greenhouse gases are deforestation from the Amazonia, and Cerrado is the Brazilian savanna. And you know, most of it are illegal and practiced in Brazil by the organized crimes. Why? And you know, the Brazilian Constitution says that the Amazonia is a national patrimony, and its all the activities are completely illegal. then what's going on? It's, in my opinion, that we are not able, but it's more challenging than this. We must understand that the only way is to put people in the streets saying to the politicians, the political parties, even society, that we are not supporting this kind of policies. You know, Alexandre mentioned some years ago, we have a very important street mobilizations, is 10 years ago almost, and the trigger was the elevation of the transport prices. Then in São Paulo. Then my answer is, let's try to do what we are supposed to do in Brazil 40 years ago when you have a dictatorship, and call the people to go to the streets. Because we have a good example in Brazil 3 months ago when you have a discussion in the Congress, and the solution was mobilizing people, especially in Rio de Janeiro. You was there. Let me prove. Give me the picture. That's a joke. Talita, are you writing this? Okay. But I think when as a old environmentalist, I think we must think how can we mobilize people to put pressure on governments and even companies, you know, and to have the support of the scientific community in order to make the good place or feasible place. You know, this is, I don't know if I'm answering you because there is no answer, but I'm trying.
Thank you very much, Fábio. Thank you very much, Alexandre. I think we have to come to a close because Fábio suggested a revolution here, so let's stop here now. I'd like to thank you very much, Alexandre and Fábio, for this opening remark, for this plenary session. So let's come to a close here. We are right on time. Brazil does not have a good tradition of keeping things on time, so I want to change that perception about that. So let's go close the session. Thank you very much.